was 2:30 a.m. when I made my way through the Paris cemetery, my flashlight guiding me as I surveyed the crumbling statues and headstones. As a recent art school graduate, I had been hired to restore the cemetery's unique tombs and had developed an unusual interest in cemetery architecture. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Unexplained footprints in the soil leading up to some of the graves. They appeared to be leading towards a freshly dug grave that had been dug up and left open. My heart began to race as I approached the open grave, wondering who or what could have disturbed it. The rain made the soil muddy and difficult to see, but the footprints seemed fresh as if someone had just been there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. As I investigated the vandalized graves, I heard a faint whispering sound that seemed to be coming from all around me. The whispers grew louder and more frantic, causing my palms to sweat. The sound reminded me of a terrifying experience I had in a haunted house attraction, where I heard ghostly whispers that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. The fear I felt came rushing back, and I realized I was in danger in the cemetery. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me. Shining my flashlight, I noticed shadowy figures moving between the graves. They seemed to follow the footprints, disappearing and reappearing as they moved. I couldn't distinguish distinct features, but I could feel their evil intent. One of the cemetery's groundskeepers had been acting strangely lately, and I started to suspect they may have something to do with the disturbance. However, it later became clear that the groundskeeper was grieving the loss of a loved one and had been acting out of character. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I looked around the deserted cemetery. I had uncovered the disturbing truth about the footprints, but the revelation had only led to more questions. Was the wrongly accused person responsible for the recent vandalism, or was there more to the story? As I pondered the possibilities, a sudden gust of wind swept through the graveyard, causing the trees to creak and moan. In the distance, I heard a faint whisper, and my blood ran cold. The same voice warned me of the danger lurking in the cemetery. I knew I had to leave, but my feet felt heavy as if rooted. It was as if an invisible force was holding me back, and I couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped. Finally, panic started as I realized I might not make it out alive. The whisper grew louder, and I could make out a few words. "You should have left well enough alone." It hissed, and with that, a cold hand touched my shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through my body. I turned around, ready to face my fate, but no one was there. The cemetery was empty, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves. But I knew in my heart that the vengeful spirit was still out there, biding its time, waiting for its next victim. I stumbled out of the cemetery, my heart pounding in my chest. As I looked back at the dark, foreboding gates, I knew I had uncovered a secret that was better left buried. And I also knew that the ghostly whispers and shadowy figures would haunt me for the rest of my life. The power of the unknown. As a night shift guard in a Parisian cemetery, I've seen my fair share of strange and inexplainable things. The darkness of the night always seemed to bring out the supernatural elements that resided within the grounds. But, for me, it was just another day at work. On this particular night, I patrolled the cemetery, ensuring everything was in order. The moon shone bright, casting an eerie glow over the grave markers, and the only sound I could hear was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Something caught my eye as I made my way through the rows of graves. There was a figure in the distance, walking aimlessly through the headstones. I couldn't distinguish who or what it was, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was a feeling that I knew all too well. I continued my rounds, but I was fixated on that mysterious figure. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Then, I noticed the time on my watch and realized that I had been on duty for hours. The hands of clock ticked away, and I knew that my shift would soon be over. I went to the rest cabin, eager to catch some shut-eye before my next shift. But, as I entered, I was greeted by an eerie silence. I had left the window open to let in some fresh air, but now it was shut tight. I screamed out in fear and immediately called the police. When they arrived, they searched the entire cemetery but found nothing. The police searched every nook and cranny of the cemetery, but to no avail. As I watched them combing through the headstones and mausoleums, my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. How could there be nothing there? I knew what I had seen, and it was all too real. The officers finished their search and returned to me with a reassuring smile.
"We didn't find anything," they said, "but we'll keep an eye on the area just in case."
I nodded, still feeling uneasy. What if whatever I had seen was still out there? Suddenly, I felt a shiver run down my spine, and a sense of dread washed over me. My heart began to race, and my palms grew slick with sweat. I knew that something was wrong, that something was watching me. I turned around, and my worst fears were confirmed. Standing before me was a man with a face so twisted and distorted that it was almost unrecognizable. His features were contorted into a grotesque mask, and his eyes glowed with an evil energy that chilled me to the bone. The man was trying to force his way through the window of the small rest cabin where I sought refuge. His skeletal hands clawed at the wooden frame, leaving deep gouges on the surface as he tried to wrench it open. His clothes were tattered and threadbare, as if he had been buried for years and had only clawed out of his grave. I could feel his evil presence radiating through the air, causing my skin to prickle with goosebumps. His twisted face seemed to loom larger and larger in the darkness, his eyes boring into me with an otherworldly intensity. I was frozen in terror for a moment, unable to move or breathe. But then, I remembered my training and drew my flashlight. With a shaking hand, I aimed the beam at the man's face, hoping to blind and drive him away. But to my horror, the light seemed not to affect him. Instead, his twisted features remained unchanged, and his eyes burned with demonic energy. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup and praying they would arrive soon. But as I waited for their response, I could feel the man's evil presence growing stronger, as if he was drawing power from the darkness around us. It was then that I realized that this was no ordinary intruder. Instead, this was a supernatural entity, a force of darkness that had somehow entered the cemetery. And as I stood there, frozen with fear, I knew I was in mortal danger. I screamed out in fear and immediately called the police. When they arrived, they searched the entire cemetery but found nothing. The police searched every nook and cranny of the cemetery but to no avail. As I watched them combing through the headstones and mausoleums, my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. How could there be nothing there? I knew what I had seen, and it was all too real. The officers finished their search and returned to me with a reassuring smile.
We didn't find anything, they said, but we'll keep an eye on the area just in case.
I nodded, still feeling uneasy. What if whatever I had seen was still out there? Days went by, and I tried to put the incident behind me, but a shiver ran down my spine every time I passed the cemetery. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until weeks later that I received a call from the police.
We found something,
The officer said.
Come down to the station and we'll fill you in.
I rushed to the station, my heart racing with anticipation and fear. When I arrived, the officers sat me down and showed me the footage from the night of the incident. At first, I couldn't make anything out of the ordinary. But then, I saw a shadowy figure lurking behind one of the graves. It moved with such fluidity, almost as if it wasn't real. The officers couldn't explain what it was, but they assured me they were still investigating. As I left the station, I couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for the power of the unknown. Nevertheless, the incident left me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off, and I knew I would never be the same again. My heart was racing as I walked through the Paris cemetery. I had seen some strange and unsettling things during my time as a security consultant, but nothing like this. The rain poured down, and the sound of it hitting the ground mixed with the crunch of gravel under my boots. The hairs on my arms stood up, and a shiver ran down my spine. As I continued my patrol, I noticed the fog getting thicker, making it difficult to see more than a few feet before me. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any movement or unusual activity. That's when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement between the headstones. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it again, and again. I drew closer, my senses on high alert. As I approached, the figure became clearer. It was a ghostly apparition, glowing in the dim moonlight. I could hear its whispers and moans and feel its cold breath on my skin. My mind raced with fear and confusion. I had heard stories of restless spirits haunting this cemetery, but always dismissed them as mere superstition. As I stood face to face with a spectral being, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. And that was just the beginning. As I continued my patrol, I noticed several graves had been vandalized. The headstones were shattered, the coffins had been ripped open, and the bodies were strewn about the cemetery. I couldn't fathom who could have done this or why. But as dawn approached, my anxiety reached its peak. I knew I had to leave the cemetery soon, but I was terrified that I wouldn't survive. The sounds and sights of the cemetery seemed to intensify as if the spirits of the dead were closing in on me, ready to claim me as their own. As I tried to piece together the night's events, I remembered the grieving widow coming to the cemetery every night to mourn her deceased husband. Unfortunately, she had been so wrapped up in her grief that she may not have noticed the vandalism. But as the story progressed, she began to suspect something was amiss and became a potential target for the vandals. I knew I needed to solve this mystery and bring the vandals to justice before anyone else got hurt. But the more I investigated, the more I realized that this wasn't the work of mere humans. Instead, this was something far more sinister and supernatural. I was afraid as the ghostly figure approached me in the Paris cemetery. His moans were growing louder and more desperate, and I was sure I was about to meet my end at the hands of an undead entity. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissipated into the fog, leaving me alone and shaken on the ground. I lay there momentarily, trying to understand what had just happened, and then it all fell into place. The footprints I had seen, the vandalized graves, and the sense of unease that had been building inside me were all connected to the cemetery's dark history. I had heard rumors about the graveyard being built on a mass grave, but I had never taken it seriously. Now, it seemed that those rumors were true. The plague outbreak that had claimed so many lives centuries ago had left a deep scar on the land. The disturbance caused by the living had awakened the restless spirits of the dead, and they sought revenge. They were angry and in pain and wanted the living to know it. As I stood up and brushed off the dirt from my clothes, I knew I had to find a way to make peace with the restless spirits. I had to find a way to communicate with them and offer them the respect and dignity they deserved. But it wouldn't be easy. The supernatural forces were beyond my comprehension. As I walked out of the cemetery, I couldn't help but feel a sense of horror and awe. The events of that night had shaken me to my core, and I knew I would never be the same again. However, the restless spirits of the cemetery had shown me the power of the unknown, and I would never forget it.